I'd like to share with you some advice when it comes to how to best prepare your written answers going into a job interview. You could prepare written answers to the most commonly asked questions, or ideally you would want to call this process building your story bank. First, let me be clear, I'm well aware that this process looks quite different for a fresher when it comes to, or compared to someone with 20 years of experience in the field. However, I believe there's some valuable lessons to be learned by making these types of comparison. And the first topic I'd like to talk about here is with respect to length. How lengthy should your answers be, especially while preparing them for a job interview? And what I found here is that for candidates who lack communication skills, there will be a significant benefit in brain dumping your stories. So in other words, I would encourage you to make brain dumps of 2 pages with everything you can remember about your stories in a bid to build the skill of learning how to pick the most compelling elements from your brain dumps in order to communicate better for the purpose of a job interview. By contrast, a candidate who can communicate well, maybe an executive, someone applying for an executive role, but not necessarily, you simply have to communicate well in general, you may expedite the process of writing your interview answers by bullet pointing them. And the major benefit for this would be you'd win a lot of time, because usually, people for more senior types of roles don't have a lot of time to prepare this going into a job interview. Now, you may wonder, what's the problem if me, as not a great communicator, would bullet point my stories and then go to role play? The problem with this approach is that your answers will sound superficial. People who cannot communicate well usually cannot communicate well because they don't know what to communicate, the most compelling elements and details of that story. So this is why the brain dumps would be the most appropriate. Of course, there's another important element that I know not many candidates have going into this job interviews, that is the time. So it's a whole different story whether you're 3 days away or 14 days away from your job interview. And of course, this will impact how much time you have and the length of the stories you can afford. But long story short, there is value in brain dumping your stories, knowing that the absolute best candidates would bullet point them going into these job interviews. Next, I'd like to talk about what is the best format to use while preparing your interview answers. And previously I said that it's in some cases a good idea to brain dump your interview answers, and when you brain dump it, there's no specific format that you must employ. It's a lengthy process. You must ensure that you can remember all possible details. That's pretty much it. However, for the purpose of a job interview, a more structured way to communicate will provide a more compelling answer during a job interview. And I'm sure you've already heard about the STAR format. This is generally a solid advice going into a job interview. However, you should be aware there are some pros and cons to structuring your answers in the STAR format. For example, one of the major problems with the STAR format is most candidates will try to front load interview answers by presenting too much of the situation plus the task. So one fix to this would be you compress the situation plus the task and then you talk about the action and the results. Or another contemporary problem with the STAR answers is that there's a fashion, there's a trend right now that everyone talks about learnings in their answers. And many candidates would fall into the trap of saying that, hey, the learnings are a must-have in any answers I give during a job interview. Whereas if you prepare, 10 answers and you add learnings to each of them, you'll realize that's not really working the same. And this brings me to my second point with regards to the format of your interview answers. Ideally, you should find the best format that suits your needs. And many of candidates are afraid to come up with their own formats. For the purpose of a job interview, I could come up with a format right now, the DAN format, description, action, and some nuggets. It's very simple. So bringing your own format to your advantage that plays on your strength, helps you sell yourself on your strength in these job interviews, is also an approach you must seriously consider. In other candidates, I found out that simply structuring their interview answers by problem and fix might also bring a lot more clarity in the way you communicate. So basically, the format, the structure that you would like to employ while communicating your answers and while preparing your written answers for the purpose of a job interview is also something essential, in my experience, if you want to score well on clarity of thought and, to interview well, so to speak. Now, I would also like to touch on the points of the quantitative type of prep versus the qualitative type of prep. First, the quantitative. So it is good advice, and I can tell you of this, of working with thousands, if not tens of thousands of candidates by now, that your story bank, if you want to prepare one, should be between 15 and 25 stories. Now, what do I mean by this? Should you prepare 15 answers to separate different interview questions? Well, could be, but I can tell you, let me present you with an extreme. I recently had a candidate who had 7 stories. Each of those stories were around 2 or 3 or even 4 pages long. Each of those 7 stories with some highlights in their careers and could easily be split into 3 to 5 stories independently. So 7 times 3, it's already 21 stories. So the number of stories, the quantitative approach, that is 15 to 25 stories, refers to the behaviors you want to touch. In other words, if you talk about conflict resolution, you must have 2-3 stories that touch on a conflict. If you want to talk about dealing with ambiguous situations, again, you have 2-3 stories, maybe a failure, maybe to highlight your delivery, your customer obsession, and these sort of things. But the main thing is that you must have sufficient quantity in a job interview. What happens if you don't have that quantity? If you only have 1 story for conflict, 1 story for data-driven decision, 1 story for customer obsession, the problem is going to repeat those stories over and over again during the job interview. And this might not come across as you think it would. They might even become suspicious of you because you don't have enough experience if you only have 1 story which has been with every other interviewer. So this is why quantity, it's a quality of its own in preparing your stories. And finally, I'd like to talk about the qualitative approach. The qualitative approach to preparing your answers refers to revising each of your interview answers at least 3 times. So in other words, if you prepare a brain dump, so to speak, a 2-page brain dump, you must pass to at least 3 more revisions in order to be interview worthy, so to speak. And this is a statistic which I spend a lot of time building and studying to be confident that this actually works in job interviews. And basically, what I'm suggesting you here is that don't rely on the first version of your interview, of your written interview answers that you prepare for a job interview. That will only be a starting point. From then on, it very much depends on your immediate needs. Where do you need to improve your skills? For example, a candidate who lacks communication skills, as soon as you're done with the brain dump, ideally you should start role-playing it. Because when you role-play it, which is, by the way, a revision, when you role-play it, you immediately get a sense as to where you are in the interview prep process. And the reason why this is important, because it will define your next steps. It's one thing to brain dump all the possible stories and only then to role-play. Then you realize, hey, I communicate already pretty decently well, so maybe I shouldn't have spent all that time to brain dump my stories when compared to role-playing them, right? So prioritization in the types of revisions you're going to make is critically important based on your specific needs. So again, I said a revision could be role-play, another revision could be formatting them, I don't know, into the STAR format or whatever other format you might find as essential. You may want to pitch, to compress your answers. You may want to lengthen, to make your answers lengthier so they can be more convincing. But the qualitative approach of preparing your interview answers is based on the fact that you must revise them at least 3 times. So I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.